Well, hi, Peter. It's sure good to be with you again here as we enter into chapters 3 and 4 of I Want You to Be with Halik.
Thanks, Hayden. Yeah, great to be moving on through these four clearing the throat chapters, as we've called them, and to see a little bit more of the groundwork that he's going to lay for us as he addresses this question. And what a treat it was to have those conversations last week with the folks who were participating in this. To you who are watching, thank you. This has been a really great way to kick things off.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, Peter. It's much easier to imagine getting to these life questions now that we have some sense of who we are developing as groups here and have our lives on the table. And speaking of which, we shared with both the groups that throughout reading this book, one of our challenges is going to be to read through Halik's world of ideas and get to his questions about life. And I think it's fair to say that these two chapters have been particularly challenging in that regard. They are tough ones to make it through. So I just want to say to folks right away that if that was the case for you, you're not alone. It was definitely the case for me too. And I think Peter Pettit would say the same. But we're going to do it. We're going to get there together. So let's start with chapter 3 a little bit, Peter, just kind of jumping in.
Sounds good. So what is the life question that you see him addressing here?
Oh my goodness. Well, we had the chance, the two of us, Peter, to go round and round on that a bit as we even got ready for this part of our conversation. And I sort of like the one that we came to, which is how in the world do we give ourselves away? How do we do it to friends, let alone to enemies? You can see it there on the handout. But as he works his way in chapter 3, dealing with love and faith, that seems to be one of the key life issues he's driving at.
Yeah, I think that's clearly what lies behind. We've drawn attention to the chapter titles as having particular significance. And this question of does love have precedence over faith ultimately ends up being significant in this chapter, and it's kind of where Halik starts, I think, but it's not where his thinking has started. I think his thinking has very much started where you're asking us to start with this question about ourselves and others, and how do we give ourselves away? He's talked about God's transcendence as being something that establishes a relationship. And so he's pretty clear early on, I think, that for him, belief in the sense of saying, yes, I believe that God exists, that there is a God, it's like, I'm not sure he finds that question interesting even.
That's exactly right. I mean, he goes right to the James passage, right? Even the demons believe and shudder. His asking us about God's existence really is not valuable, he thinks. That's not where he wants to go. But what I find so interesting as this chapter moves, Peter, is that even as we talk about loving God rather than having faith in God, because I think we're right that that's his focus, he points out quickly that this issue of loving God is not actually straightforward. It's fair to ask what it means to love God, because as we note in this first note on the handout, we really don't love God in the way that we love a home, or even in the way that we love another person. And I know a lot of that has to do with this distinction he's talking about between subject and object. And I know that's something that has struck you, Peter. Would you talk just a little bit about that?
Sure. It does strike me as really central to the way he constructs things. And he's offered me an image that is in some ways new or deeper, and I find it very helpful. without getting into all the philosophical definitions of subject and object that came with modernity, his notion, or his bringing up the point that God is not an object. Well, true, and then he says, but God is a person. And then he says, but God isn't even really a person the way we think of person. So for us, objects are things, persons are subjects. I speak about myself. I have some agency as a subject. That's what a person is. But he says, God, even though the ancient Greek used the language of person in order to construct its understanding, he says, first of all, even that formulation in the creeds, God has three persons. So we know that's not person the way we think of it. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Like I'm one person and God is somehow three persons. I think what he's getting at and what that gets at is that this division between me as a person, you as a person, and those things in the world as objects, that all fits the creation. And if we live within the creation, we can understand things in terms of subject and object. But by definition, God is not a part of the creation within it, because God created it. So God is somehow maybe throughout the creation, but also beyond creation. And so not limited to these subject-object categories, which means, and this is where I think we get beyond the philosophy to the question, that to talk about loving God is to talk about being in a relationship to the very biosphere of our lives. And what does that mean, to live in that relationship?
Yeah, I think you're right, Peter. I think that is the question. It reminds me, and it's Halik doesn't go here, but it reminds me a bit of some medieval Catholic theologians, Thomas Aquinas being one of them, that talked about love being sort of the motive of God's very creation, that God, in creating human beings and in creating the world, did it because God loves, and that love just spills over and keeps going. And whether that's exactly how Halik or Aquinas would say it or not, I think the point about this biosphere of life is similar. Halik talks about this biosphere of love that we sort of wade in like a pool rather than simply relate to as a person. So what does it mean for us to not just relate to God, but to live as somehow already in the biosphere of God's love simply by being creatures of God? That has a lot to do then with this question of how we give ourselves away, whether it's to our friends or to strangers, or, as we'll get to, even to enemies, right? Jesus's totally obnoxious claim that Halik points out as one of the centers of his inquiry. So that's it, right, Peter? I mean, that's kind of what he's getting at. Is that fair?
I think so, but can you say more for us about how understanding that God is the biosphere of our life moves us toward this notion of giving ourselves away?
Sure, yeah. I'll speak personally first, Peter, because I'm not sure Halik uses quite this language, but as he talks, I continue to be drawn to the thought that some of it has to do with the sheer way that God is giving God's self away in God's very creation, that this very biosphere of love speaks of God's giving away in a way that prompts that. But that's not really the angle Halik takes. What Halik seems more interested in getting at is, if all of the people and objects in our lives are also just a part of this biosphere, if none of them themselves are God, well, then there's a way in which we can let go and trust that simply being in that biosphere all by itself and living our way through it is enough in a certain way. And it's sort of starting in that place of trust that seems to free us up to the very notion of giving ourselves away. He brings up those great parables in Matthew and other places of the merchant selling everything for that one fine pearl, or someone selling all their possessions so that they can go and buy that one hidden treasure in the field. And he talks about the fact that even there, it's not transactional. It's not as if this one pearl or this one treasure is worth all of our belongings. It's more than that. It's that it's not even on the same plane. There's something about simply recognizing and dwelling in and ruminating in this biosphere of God's love that is more than possessing any one of these things we find within it.
Right.
And that allows us to free ourselves up to begin to think about giving ourselves away.
Yeah, that's really helpful. The thought that comes to mind as you talk about that is that in the created world of subject and object, my existence is always somewhat tenuous, because in this world, I know I die.
Yep.
And that's maybe putting it a little dramatically, but ultimately my mortality is the ultimate symbol of, or reality of, the tenuousness of my life. And if the only world in which I operate is this world, where I'm a subject surrounded by other subjects who frankly are competing for the objects of the world, then my relationship to others and to things is what he calls the possessive love, the concupiscent love, right? Because I need those in order to reassure me that my existence will continue. I need those things. I love them because they support me in my tenuous life.
Yeah.
And I think part of what he gets at as we talk about this, God is love and God is the biosphere of our living, is that because when we live in God, we're living in a world that is not dependent on subjective existence or objective usefulness. We live in a world in which God has said, and here's your Aquinas reference about God's motive of love in creation, God wants us to be, to paraphrase Halik's book title, right?
Exactly.
And if I know that God wants me to be, and if, for example, in my baptism, I know that the life I now live will not end because the power of death has been defeated, and that's been given to me in my baptism. Now, as I engage people and things, the world, I don't have to grasp at them to serve my existence. I can ask how my life can help to enrich and support and be related to their existence. And that transcending of the self, that creating the relationship, that's what Halik has suggested love is. Beginning with God's love in even making a creation to which God can relate.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Peter. And I actually think it brings us right into chapter 4, because if, yeah, right? Because if chapter 3 clearly names this goal of giving ourselves away rather than taking possession, I think chapter 4 has a way of slowing down and naming that that's a process. That's a journey in its own right. Perhaps even that part of what we're doing as we grasp at things is trying to bring God close. And Halik wants to say that's too fast. We sort of need to dwell in God's remoteness or God's hiddenness, not for the sake of feeling abandoned by God, though it may feel like that at times, but rather for all of the reasons that you just gave. So this brings us to a really interesting place in Halik's book, because he's both challenging the church as an institution to get at this more deeply, and sort of willing to learn from non-believers or agnostics or atheists in his own context.
Yeah.
So if we try to get at both of those things briefly here, Peter, as we think about the institution of the church or Christianity, what do you see Halik saying about how this idea of God's remoteness relates to the church's own reluctance to let go of the closeness of God in its own being?
Yeah. I think what he's saying is that for centuries, the church understood itself to be the mechanism by which God became close to people. And in that sense, if that's what the church was going to, so to speak, deliver for and to believers, then it needed to have a huge measure of control. It needed to be powerful. It needed to be able to define things and assure people that its definition was right. And what he points out is that, from the onset of modernity with the scientific method and a change in philosophical understandings of human beings, which gave rise to the battle for the Bible and creation versus evolution and those sorts of things, beginning with that, and then moving even more recently into what we know as the postmodern, where every claim to know something is seen as partial and defined in part by where I stand, right? That with that, the church's former ability to present a completely controlled environment in which God could be made close sort of became inadequate. It wasn't up to the way in which human experience has actually developed. And so what he's asking, I think, is, do we have hints from within earlier church tradition about how the church can deal with, can respond to, can continue to be faithful in an era when God isn't felt to be close and available and deliverable? And actually, he's suggesting that this era of God's seeming remoteness can be a gift to the church, a gift to the world in and through the church, but even apart from the church, in realizing that God is not always entirely close, but there's something really transcendent about God that not the church, not modernity, not post-modernity, not philosophy, not theology, not anything is going to be able to capture.
Wow, that all sounds right, Peter, and it sounds kind of overwhelming. So it brings me to two places.
Okay.
The first is, you talked about how part of how Halik deals with that sweeping history is by identifying some resources within the Christian tradition to deal with that remoteness of God. And the one that in this chapter he gives the most attention to is Christian mysticism, especially in the form of what he calls negative theology,
Right.
which, as I understand it, takes as its premise that kind of remoteness of God, that anything we sort of can get our hands on, that's not God. And so because of that starting point of negative theology and Christian mysticism, that becomes a really helpful starting point for our own place in history, Halik thinks, as we deal with our own experience, which admittedly is different, but nevertheless is similar in terms of this feeling of distance from, or the remoteness of God.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And I think just knowing that much might help folks digest that part of the chapter a little better.
Right.
The other is that as I think about that whole sweeping history, it sounds really overwhelming and it's easy for me to get lost. And so what I appreciate is Halik gives this metaphor near the end of the chapter of each of these periods, from the church to Christian culture to modernity and on, as ships that are sort of out at sea. There's a way in which all of them are sinking. Even post-modernity might be sinking, he suggests, which is a kind of mind-bending claim. So in the midst of that great image, he asks the question, what would we salvage? Can we agree on what to salvage from each of these ships? And I wonder if we might turn to that quickly, just to give people an idea of Halik's answer to that. I think it's on page 52 here, if I remember right. It's the very last page of the chapter.
Right. And it's interesting because he suggested that we can have valuable things even from those 5 kinds of atheism that you refer to on the handout. And particularly, he looks at scientific atheism, which he says really helps the church remember that God is really transcendent, but also humanistic philosophy.
Secular humanism, he calls
secular
it.
humanism, which help the church remember that God is also really deeply immanent. And so that's where, when I talk about the biosphere and where is God, it's like God is through the creation, that's the immanence, but God is also beyond the creation, that's the transcendence. And he sees value even in these atheisms of our day, that as reminders to the church. And so when he talks about his 5 things that he would take in the lifeboat from these foundering ships that you've described, he's pulling things not just from the church's past, but also from the cultural past.
Yeah.
And so one of those comes from the immediate cultural past of post-modernity, and that is this notion that nobody has a corner on objective truth, that the best we can ever do, given our human limitations, is to describe the world the way we see it. But we all see it a little bit differently, and some people see it really differently. Yep. And he wants us to hold on to that insight of the postmodern, as I think, frankly, as a prompt to our humility, to remember, as he said already in the first 2 chapters, we don't know everything, and we can't.
Yep, I think that's right. And so as we find ourselves in that place of not knowing everything and not being able to know everything, all is not lost. He also invites us to remember from modernity some really great critical thinking skills that as a culture we've kind of come to develop, alongside a deep respect for human persons that is in its own way at the core of modernity. So I find that helpful, that if what we save from post-modernity is a deep humility about what we can know, what we can save from modernity is all the tools that we do have to know and to care for each other.
And then he goes on to the heritage of the church itself, which he says in some ways is the most difficult for him, if only because he knows the ways in which the church's efforts at control and dominance and delivery of God have actually been harmful in different places and centuries, probably some seminaries too. But he does say that from the church's heritage, we can't give up the Bible. And I think it's really interesting that he chooses the Bible, because it is, in my experience, the most pluralistic source of Christianity that we have. The one that already embodies internal contradictions. And he has said it, in many ways, it asks a lot more questions than it answers. And so he wants to hold on to that treasure book of questions that we know as the Bible.
So wait, Peter, I thought Halik was Catholic, but he wants to save the Bible. I find that really helpful,
yeah,
and a good reminder.
We can't get snarky about Roman Catholics here, Hayden, but he does not say he wants to save either the papacy or canon law. He wants to save the Bible.
Yeah.
But if he's willing to hear something valuable from an atheist, maybe he's willing to hear something valuable also from Martin Luther. I don't know.
You know, he does talk about us being turned in on ourselves in this chapter a bit too. So maybe.
Another great Lutheran trope.
Well, next he goes to the whole world of theology and philosophy, and zeroes in on that resource we've already talked about, which is negative theology. And again, he sees it especially as coming out of mystical experience and, in a way, helping to protect us from all kinds of idolatry. I find it amazing to think that as he reflects on the vast history of theology and philosophy, that he has the humility not to claim any particular insight or tradition as valuable, but instead to name that tradition within the tradition that says none of it's final. None of it is God on its own. Instead, we remain on this journey. That's kind of neat.
Right. Yeah, before we look at the fifth one, I just need to say that I've been thinking this all the way along as I've been reading chapters 3 and 4, and we've been talking about it, that I'm just struck over and over and over again by the number of times and ways that he invites us, as he said in the earlier chapters, and as Kierkegaard said, you know, he says, a Christian must be ready to walk on water. Because when we give up the certainties of the pre-modern, the traditional Christendom of the Middle Ages, antiquity in the Middle Ages, where, you know, God said it and that's just the way it is. When we give up on the certainties of objectivism, of objective reality as modernity handed it to us in scientific method and the human as the measure of all things, when we give up even on the postmodern claim to unmask all of the falsehoods and deceptions that serve power interests, and somehow by unmasking them, or as the postmoderns say, deconstructing them, if we're going to give up even on that as a way to get to what is really real, then what Halik is asking us to do, and this is the mystic's journey of negative theology, is to trust that that which we cannot name, we cannot explain, we do not control, we cannot deliver, that is exactly the firm ground on which we find our lives sustained. But, and that becomes, I think, the definition of faith. Anyway.
Thank you, Peter. No, you're exactly right. I think it's a helpful recapturing of that whole journey. And And I think we do have to add, as we look to this fifth one, that it's interesting that in the midst of all that, Halik does hold on to the Trinity as so central, which I think it's fair to say I'm sure he has a lot of respect for all the philosophical and theological knots that got the Christian tradition to the Trinity, but his affinity for it seems to come again from this place of the centrality of relationship and love. He sees God as a relational being even before creation, as central to what the Trinity is about. And so that's a good reminder as we move forward with the book too, that somehow that biosphere of love is the very biosphere of God's being from even before the beginning, as it were, in what we call the Trinity. So, well, Peter, I'm excited to see how the group processes all of this with us. It'll be great to hear their insights and their questions, and just to be together again. But I want to circle back for just a second before we finish in thinking about chapter 4 to what really is the life issue of chapter 4, because it's a lot to think about and it's really rich. But I wonder if there are a couple things. One of them we've already talked quite a bit about, which is namely, how do we come to terms with our own Christian tradition in its best and worst? I think that's a fair question for us to wrestle with, and
Absolutely.
And one that we all care about. And I think another that's related is, how do we experience this remoteness of God as a gift on the journey? What does that look like and mean for us? So those are two places we can go, I think.
It sounds great. I wonder somewhat, knowing who's in our group and having been in those conversations, I'm not sure we as a group discussing this have a lot of experience of the remoteness of God. Maybe we just need more time together before we can really risk sharing those points of remoteness. I don't know, and that's not meant to pressure anybody, but I also, even more than that, just wonder whether we who are part of this conversation have a little bit of difficulty relating to the remoteness of God, just because where we find ourselves in the conversations that we're in and the things that we're committed to and what has us all together for this. So it'll be very interesting for us to explore this, and really appreciate your guidance and leading us through the handout and into the conversation here, Hayden. Thanks much.
Great. Well, thanks, Peter. I'm looking forward to it.